Harassment. It's a word, well, it feels like it's everywhere today, right? We hear it constantly. But what does it actually mean? Not just generally, but according to one very specific framework.
Yeah.
We've got a document here.
Exactly. Yeah, we've got this really interesting source material for this deep dive. It's a document that lays out its own, quite distinct take on what it calls harassment law.
And this deep dive, it's really for you listening. Our goal here is to cut through the noise, and guide you straight to the core ideas inside this specific document. Help you quickly grasp its definitions, its kind of logic, and maybe what makes its perspective stand out.
Think of it like this document offers a particular lens, and it seems to blend concepts we might, associate with legal definition with other principles, including some pretty explicit religious references that are right there in the text.
Okay.
So we're basically just here to unpack what this document says, word for word, idea for idea.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So where does this source even begin to define harassment? How does it lay it out?
It starts by building its definition on four main points. It's actually a very clear structure right from the start.
4 points. Okay. And the first pillar, according to this source.
The source identifies the first type as, and I'm quoting here, repetitive ask of something they don't want to do.
Repetitive unwanted requests. Okay. And what does the source say is the impact of doing that?
It states pretty plainly, this makes someone uncomfortable or angry.
Okay. Discomfort or anger.
No.
And it gives a reason for this being wrong, the rationale.
Yeah, it's quite direct. It just says, nobody asks someone to do what they don't want to do repeatedly. Simple as that, seemingly. And then right away, this is where we see it bring in a broader principle. It references religion, saying, even religion God said, don't force it on others.
Ah, interesting.
So this first point connects that persistent, unwanted pressure, the kind that causes discomfort or anger, to this idea of not forcing things. It's not just about the action itself. It seems linked to, compulsion.
That's a strong start. Okay, what's the second point the source raises? Point number 2.
The second definition it gives is physical advances without permission.
Physical advances without consent. Makes sense. What's the source's reasoning given for including this one?
The document says this, might cause a fight or at least anger. So it's framed around the potential for immediate conflict or, a strong negative emotional reaction.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, like you hinted at earlier. Because the source includes something under this point that you might not expect, a specific religious reference, but it's about looking. It's not just about touching someone.
Yes, exactly. It explicitly states, God even said, don't look at someone's women. So even looking with desire is forbidden unless she is single look in a decent way.
Wow. Okay, so the source isn't just talking about, say, unwanted touching. It seems to fold looking with desire, under certain specific circumstances mentioned there, into this category of physical advances. What does that tell us about how this source sees personal boundaries, or what counts as an advance? It feels much broader.
It definitely expanded the concept, doesn't it? Significantly beyond perhaps more typical definitions. It suggests that for this source, unwanted visual attention, if it has a certain intent behind it, is actually seen as a form of intrusive interaction, almost physical in its impact, perhaps.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so moving on then. The third category the source defines.
That one's listed straightforwardly as inappropriate sexual language.
Okay, and the consequences. What does the source describe happens with this?
It says, and again I'm quoting, it definitely will trigger trouble and anger and uncomfortable situation. So again, that focuses on the immediate negative impact and the potential for conflict.
Right. And the source also contrasts this, doesn't it? It contrasts this negative behavior with what it sees as like the positive way to communicate.
It does, yeah. It brings in another religious reference here. It says, God said, just say good to people. That means in anything or any subject matter.
Okay.
So the source seems to frame that inappropriate language as harassment, partly by setting it against this principle of just speaking well to others. Always. It's like setting up a positive standard.
And harassment falls short of that standard. Okay, so we've got unwanted requests, physical advances, including that unique take on looking and inappropriate language. What's the final defining point in this source?
The fourth point is making uncomfortable situation for someone intentionally. This one really zeroes in on intent.
Intentionally causing discomfort. How does the source suggest we figure out if it is intentional?
It just says, it's intentional by the fact presented of the incident.
Ah.
So according to the source, the act itself, the context, kind of makes the intent clear. It speaks for itself.
And the source makes a really strong comparison here, doesn't it? It gets quite dramatic.
It does.
It says if someone intentionally wants to make someone else uncomfortable, it's like he forcing hate. And that is the work of the devil, as God said.
Yeah, it definitely raises the stakes there. The source equates intentionally causing that discomfort with actively forcing hate onto someone.
Wow.
And then attributes that to a concept of evil, the devil.
Yeah.
It puts intentional psychological discomfort on a very, very serious level within its own framework.
It really is striking how the source weaves these things together. You know, the actions, the impacts, the intent, and these explicit moral or religious principles. It's all part of the definition.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens then? What does the source say should happen when harassment, as it defines it, occurs? Does it talk about justice or consequences?
Yes, it does touch on that. For consequences, or maybe justice, the source proposes, quote, we should make them uncomfortable, like put them in jail for a while and take courses on the matter.
Make them uncomfortable so the consequence mirrors the harm caused.
Seems to be the idea, yeah.
Like, if the act was causing discomfort, the punishment involves discomfort jail plus some education.
Exactly. It ties the consequence directly back to the nature of the harm, as described in its definitions. A sort of balancing, maybe.
Now, this source is also pretty careful to explicitly state what is not harassment. That's just as important for understanding its boundaries, right?
It is, yeah. Very important clarification. The source states that it's okay to ask someone if they are single or want to initiate an intimate relationship.
Okay, so asking someone out or seeing if they're available isn't automatically harassment in this source's view.
Correct.
But there's a big condition attached to that, isn't there? It's only okay if, well, the phrasing is a bit odd. It says it's not harassment if it's done inappropriate with appropriate way that's not harassment.
Yes, that exact phrasing is a little unusual. Inappropriate with appropriate way.
Right. What do you think it's getting at there?
Well, based on everything else we've just discussed, the 4 points, it seems to be saying that initiating that kind of conversation, asking about a relationship, is acceptable only if it follows the source's own rules, its own guidelines we just went through.
Meaning, presumably, you ask once, maybe appropriately, but not repeatedly. If you get a no, that's point 1.
Right.
You don't do it with unwanted physical advances, including that looking thing from point 2. You don't use inappropriate sexual language, point 3. And you don't do it with the contention of making them uncomfortable, which was point 4.
Exactly. That seems to be the logic. It appears the source is carving out this specific space for initiating relationships, but only if it's done respectfully and appropriately.
Okay.
According to its own very specific definitions of what constitutes harassment.
And the justification given. Why is this kind of asking? Okay.
The source calls it human nature following the guideline above.
Human nature.
Yeah. It frames that appropriate way of initiating things as a natural drive, something distinct from the harmful actions it defined earlier as harassment.
So if we put it all together for you listening, this source gives a really distinct definition. It's not just a dry list of rules.
Not at all.
It blends specific actions with their impact, backs them up with these explicit religious or moral directives, proposes a specific kind of consequence that mirrors the harm, and then clearly carves out an exception for starting relationships, but only if done by its rules, and justifies that based on human nature.
It's a whole package deal, really.
Yeah.
A complete self-contained framework.
So what does this all mean for how you might think about harassment when you encounter a framework like this one? It's definitely a different way to define and maybe police behavior.
Yeah, maybe to just quickly recap the key takeaways from this specific source for you. Harassment in this view is primarily defined by those 4 things. Repetitive unwanted asks, non-consensual physical advances, remember, including certain kinds of looking inappropriate sexual language, and intentional discomfort. These definitions are grounded in the impact they have, and they're bolstered by specific reasons, including those religious references right in the text.
Okay.
The source then suggests a kind of justice that mirrors the offense, making the offender uncomfortable, plus education.
Got it.
And crucially, it explicitly says, asking someone about being single or wanting a relationship is not harassment, if done appropriately according to its own rules, justifying this as human nature.
It's certainly a comprehensive and unique perspective presented within this single document.
You know, what's really fascinating here, and maybe something for you to consider, is how this source weaves together all these different kinds of reasoning.
How so?
Well, it outlines specific actions, like laws might, describes psychological effects, draws on these explicit religious or moral commands, talks about human nature, and suggests a consequence reflecting the harm. It mixes all these threads into one single concept of harassment law. So this raises a really interesting question, I think. When a definition of something like harassment combines legal-style rules with explicit moral directives, religious ideas, concepts of human nature, how does that blending fundamentally shape the understanding? How does it change the boundaries, the feeling, and maybe the application of that concept itself? Something to think about.